Welcome to this explainer. We usually look for threats across the ocean, right? But sometimes the most wild historical events happen quite literally in our own backyards. Today, we're digging right into declassified U.S. Army files to uncover a 1957 military operation conducted directly on American soil. We're going to be focusing closely on the forgotten victims of 1957 and examining exactly how the military tested the absolute limits of the air we breathe. Let's get right into it. Picture this. It's a cold morning back in 1957, and a U.S. Army plane takes off from an Ohio air base. But here's the catch. Its mission wasn't to fly overseas to fight the Soviets. Actually, its target was Minnesota.
And by the time that plane finally touched back down, it had released an invisible, toxic chemical cloud over a staggering distance. We're talking 1,000 miles, stretching all the way from the Dakotas straight down to Chicago. And the absolute craziest detail from the files? Zero warning. Nobody on the ground had a clue.
So to understand how on earth this happened, we've got to look at Operation LAC, which stands for Large Area Coverage. Now, picture the 1950s. The Cold War is at its absolute peak, and paranoia is running super high. The Pentagon was terrified the Soviet Union might drop biological weapons, stuff like anthrax or plague, from the sky. But they had this one big question. If a bioweapon is dropped over a city, how far does it actually spread? Well, since you obviously can't just test that on an enemy, the military realized the only way to find out was to test it on themselves. Of course, they couldn't just unleash actual deadly diseases on American cities, so they needed a stand-in. They came up with a plan to swap out biological agents for a chemical that behaves exactly like them in the air. Enter zinc cadmium sulfide. They picked this specific stuff because it glows under UV light, making it super easy to track. The armies swore up and down to the public and local officials that it was entirely harmless. And so, between 1957 and 1958, they ran dozens of tests. They were spraying it out of planes, off rooftops, and even out of moving cars, over places like Minneapolis, South Carolina, and New York. But here's where it gets really unsettling. The particles of this chemical were so incredibly microscopic, they didn't just casually float up in the atmosphere. No, they came right through people's windows. They settled onto children's toys, onto food, and straight into the drinking water. To put that into perspective, a person could unknowingly inhale 10,000 of these microscopic particles in a single breath and never even know it. Section 1. The Forgotten Victims of 1957. Ground-level impact. Let's take a look. So this wasn't just some random one-off flight in 57. The military actually meticulously ramped up their testing over several years. If you look at the early 50s, way before the massive cross-country drops, they ran highly targeted operations in specific urban neighborhoods. You've got Operation Big Tom in 1953, then Operation Pruitt in 1954, both in St. Louis. And that was followed by spray tests down in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1956. Now, you might be wondering, why St. Louis? Well, the Army specifically zeroed in on Pruitt-Igoe, which was a low-income, predominantly black neighborhood at the time. And if you read the Army's own declassified documents, the reason is right there in black and white. This area has a population density similar to Moscow. They were literally using these neighborhoods as a mock-up for a Soviet city. On the ground, the reality was just heartbreaking. The military strapped sprayers onto rooftops and station wagons and just drove through the streets pumping out this incredibly dense fog. Kids playing outside honestly thought they were just smoke machines running behind the trucks and playing right in the chemical clouds. And it didn't take long for the fallout to hit. Mothers started reporting their kids were getting nasty rashes, high fevers, and severe breathing problems, which left local doctors completely baffled. And this wasn't just happening in St. Louis. Down in Corpus Christi, Texas, right after the 1956 spray tests, a local paper reported a sudden, absolutely tragic spike in miscarriages and stillbirths. The Army's response? Well, they set a team down there, sure, but strictly to harvest data. They didn't offer a shred of medical help to the victims. Moving on to Section 2. The Toxic Truth Revealed. Public Lies versus Internal Knowledge. This is where the contrast gets wild. The Army straight up told local officials in St. Louis that they were just testing a harmless smokescreen to protect the city from a Russian attack. But when you look at a declassified internal memo from 1955, it says right there, zinc cadmium sulfide is toxic. Long-term exposure can cause cancer of the lungs, kidneys, and prostate. Basically, they knew exactly how dangerous it was before they even launched the wider 1957 drops. Yet, despite
all this sickness happening on the ground, the military patted themselves on the back. They considered Operation LAC a massive success. Their final report concluded that a single release point could cover up to 60% of the United States, meaning a large area coverage weapon was highly feasible. From a purely tactical standpoint, they learned they could effectively blanket millions of people with just one plane.
Section 3. A legacy without accountability. The aftermath today. So fast forward decades later. It wasn't until 1997, under immense pressure from Congress, that the Army finally came clean. Well, sort of. They officially admitted to spraying this toxic stuff over 33 areas across the US and Canada. But here's the kicker. Independent researchers who actually studied the flight paths and declassified logs estimate the real number of contaminated zones is well over 200.
Naturally, when those forgotten victims from the 50s finally got their hands on this declassified proof, they tried to seek justice, right? Citizens filed lawsuits in the 1990s, but the government's legal defense was incredibly frustrating. They essentially said, hey, because these tests happened back in the 50s, too much time has passed for us to prove a direct medical link to your illnesses. They basically used the sheer passage of time as a get-out-of-jail-free card.
And the resulting legacy? It's pretty grim. To this very day, the U.S. government has issued exactly 0 formal apologies to the citizens they sprayed. 0 compensation has been paid out. And maybe worst of all, 0 official health studies have ever been conducted on the exposed families to see how this chemical impacted them across generations. The very taxpayers funding this were left entirely in the dark. And if you think the physical legacy of these tests is just buried in the past, well, it's actually still buried in the dirt. In 2012, a geology team testing the soil over in the St. Louis neighborhood of Pruitt-Igoe found abnormally high levels of cadmium still lingering there. That's nearly 60 years after those station wagons rolled through. Actually, that specific neighborhood, Pruitt-Igoe, it was completely demolished in the 1970s. The city claimed it was because of rising crime rates. That was the public excuse for tearing down the housing projects. But looking at the contamination data we have now, researchers point out a much darker reality. The area was likely just way too contaminated with heavy metals for anyone to safely live there.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, at least we have the whole story now, right? Actually, scratch that, we don't. The military ran a follow-up program, appropriately named Operation LAC 2, and those files, they are still entirely classified. Hidden from the public, locked away, and they won't even be eligible for declassification until the year 2032.
It leaves us with this really chilling historical reality. Operation LAC wasn't just some abstract defense against a foreign threat. It was a massive experiment run on innocent citizens to see how you could control the air itself. The forgotten victims of 1957 were literal kids playing in the street and mothers who thought they were just seeing protective fog. So as we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with this. After seeing all the data, the declassified memos, and the complete lack of accountability, what do you think? Is this something that should be taught in our standard history books? Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep questioning the history around you.